Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet, and for good reason. We could also call him the tactless prophet because he seems not to grasp the concept of breaking bad news gently. I did my very best to avoid this first reading this morning from Jeremiah. I don't think anybody really came to church this rainy fall morning to hear a sermon about a man who prays to God, "Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of my poor people." That might have worked in the 6th century BC, but these days people come to church to be uplifted. The preacher's job is to send the worshipers out the door whistling a happy tune, or so I have been told. According to Marcus Borg, whose opinion in many matters I honor, worship is supposed to be only for us. We should expect to get something out of it, something that's useful. And if we can't get something that's useful, at least we should get a lift from our investment of time on a Sunday morning. But here he is amongst us, this weeping prophet, sitting on the front pew, crying his eyes out. What is Jeremiah's problem anyway? When Jeremiah was a young man, King Josiah was on the throne of Judah. And in that period, Judah's arch enemy, Assyria, was waning in power and pretty much left Judah alone. One of King Josiah's first acts was to restore the temple in Jerusalem, which was in ruins. And in the process of that restoration, a copy of the book of Deuteronomy was discovered. Spurred by the vision of what faithfulness to the God of Israel and Judah really could look like, Josiah started an ambitious campaign of restoration and reform. The shrines to the gods of Assyria and Babylonia, which dotted the countryside, were all torn down. The priests of those shrines were either killed or brought to Jerusalem for continuing education. The temple once again became the center of piety and pride for Judah. Josiah pretty well had managed to get the cultic trains running on time when he was inconveniently killed in battle. And he was succeeded by his son Jehoiakim, who did not have his daddy's administrative ability or zeal for liturgical renewal. So by the time Jeremiah was a full-fledged prophet, in his eyes, everything was going to pot. The law, which the people had been so excited about when they rediscovered it, was never written on their hearts. It was just given lip service. Priests in the temple were keeping the cult going, but a dangerous attitude developed. People figured so long as the temple perked along, they were safe. Apparently, there was even a mantra, a slogan that went something like, "The Lord is in Zion, the King is in her Jerusalem." In other words, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. For Jeremiah, the heart of the people's problem was idolatry. Not only were the old Assyrian gods popping up in people's homes and in the countryside, the temple itself had become a kind of idol. People figured that so long as the temple rolled along, they could hedge their bets, worshiping other gods as well as the God of Judah, ignoring the spirit of the law. Idolatry, after all, is just a way to leverage your relationship with God. You don't have to have a carved idol on your hearth to be an idolater. An idolater is anyone who thinks that he or she can manipulate God. Jeremiah was convinced that the people of Judah had gone so far down this idolatrous road that there was now no turning back. Storm clouds were developing toward the north. Judah's enemies were gaining strength. Disaster was imminent. God had decided to punish God's people, and there was no changing God's mind. Hence, we have this lament, which those who preach sermons and those who have to listen to them would so much rather avoid. My joy is gone, grief is upon me, my heart is sick. Hark, the cry of my poor people, far and wide is heard in the land. Is the Lord not in Zion? Is her King not in her? You'd cry too if you thought that the nation you loved had taken a wrong turn, and it was already too late to turn back. The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. Now what, you may ask, has any of that to do with us today? The United States is not ancient Judah. We don't have a king to rule over us. And the guy in the pulpit this morning is certainly no Jeremiah. But the longer I wrestled with these verses this week, the more resonance it seemed to have for our life today. Jeremiah tells a truth that nobody else wants to hear, not those in power and not those who claim to serve the one true God. He tells kings that they are making stupid alliances with foreign powers. He tells priests that their ritual is empty. He tells ordinary people that they are worshiping idols no matter how faithful they are coming to church. Nobody wants to hear that. Not in Jeremiah's day and not in ours. As the details of the massacre at the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. were unfolding early last week, President Obama took a moment from a speech he was making to honor the victims of that shooting. They were all patriots, he said. They were all loyal Americans, he said, which of course is exactly what we expect the president to say at such times as this. It takes a Jeremiah to point out that there's nothing heroic about being gunned down while eating your breakfast at the commissary of the Navy Yard. There's nothing courageous about being the victim of yet another mass shooting in a gun-drunk culture. Perhaps the people who died last Monday were patriots. I hope they were. But getting shot doesn't make you a patriot. The president is a very smart man. He knows this. He knows that what he says about those victims doesn't really make sense, but he can never say so publicly. Because part of his job is to maintain the myth that the military is sacrosanct. By virtue of office, this president, every president, is the Pontifex Maximus of the armed services, the high priest, as well as the commander-in-chief. Thus, when any military personnel, indeed even civilian defense contractors, are shot, they instantly become patriots and courageous Americans. Were he with us today, Jeremiah would point this out. It's the kind of candor that got him thrown down a well and left to die. You might think that the slaughter of another dozen people by a mentally ill gunman would spur calls for better mental health care or even gun control, but we have already been down that road. If the murder of children in their classrooms and folks watching a Batman movie did not spur reform, then it's not likely that what happened in the Navy Yard last week will spur reform either. Jeremiah would say we have our priorities out of order, that care for children and the mentally ill should come first, and satisfying our lust for firearms should come last. Anyone who gives voice to that notion today will not be thrown down a well, but that person will be shouted down by the National Rifle Association, while our elected officials cower in silence. If that were not enough to make a grown man cry, consider that the climate is reaching its tipping point. Global climate change, triggered by our use of fossil fuels, is well underway, and unless we change, there will be no going back. And yet we are seriously considering building a pipeline to funnel Canadian tar sands to oil refineries on the coast. This is the stuff that produces 30% more greenhouse gases than the oil we're already using. We're behaving like an addict who switches from cocaine to heroin in order to kick the habit. Instead of giving up the idols of the past, we cling to them with a death grip. It would be so easy to agree with Jeremiah that the season for rescue has passed, that the options for a better future have closed, that the window of opportunity is shut tight, the harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. It's enough to make a grown man weep. It's enough to make him pray, "Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I might weep day and night." You and I are not threatened by Assyrian troops, but by our own greed and folly. Were he with us today, Jeremiah would shed no fewer tears for us than for Judah. There is a curious ambiguity in these verses from Jeremiah 8 and 9. It's not always easy to tell who is speaking in these verses. At one point, it seems that Jeremiah is himself the speaker, and there are places where it seems the Lord is the speaker, and there are places where it's impossible to tell who is speaking, the Lord or the prophet. My joy is gone, my grief is upon me, my heart is sick. Who says that? Jeremiah or the Lord? For the hurt of my poor people I am hurt. I mourn, and despair has taken hold of me. Who mourns? Who is in dismay? The prophet of God, or the God whom the prophet speaks for? Nobody can tell, not even Hebrew scholars, by reading the text. What is crystal clear is that Jeremiah takes no pleasure in speaking the truth to power, that God takes no pleasure in letting God's beloved people stew in their own juice. Jeremiah was sure that God had decided to use Judah's enemies as a punishment of the people. Not being a prophet, I could never be so sure how to read the times. What I do believe is that God's terrible non-intervention is punishment enough. We bring enough trouble down on our own heads all by ourselves. There's no need to blame God for our bad choices. It's not God's fault that we expect our leaders to tell us what we want to hear. It's not God's fault that we think teachers armed with guns are more important than feeding hungry children. Last week, the House of Representatives voted to take 3.8 million people off the food stamp rolls in 2014. 83% of the people who receive SNAP benefits now are families with children and disabled persons and elderly persons. These neighbors might well consider, why are we being punished? It's not God who is punishing them. It's politicians who have lost their way. Or, I sometimes wonder, it's politicians who have lost their minds. Jeremiah was right about Judah. For them it was too late. Pray to God, brothers and sisters, that it is not too late for us. The gospel tells us that the God who shares our tears, the God who in Jesus shares our lives, does more than weep with us. That God sets us free to love God and neighbor. In love, the triune God will never let us go. But in love and justice, the triune God will not let us rest while children go hungry in a land of plenty and politicians take pride in their hellish indifference. Tears are altogether appropriate. Jeremiah is always welcome, even though he is a terrible wet blanket. But tears, even a prophet's tears, are not enough. Tears will not get the job done. You and I can do better. For God's sake, we must. With God's help, we will. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.